I'm Katherine Collins. I'm an investor. I have been for over 35 years. And the form of investing I'm really excited about is a kind of holistic form of investing that tries to take all of the information that we know is important and incorporate it into the investment process instead of settling for something that's much more narrow. So my current role is I'm the head of sustainable investing at Putnam Investments here in town. The reason we think a holistic approach to investing is needed is that we know sustainability issues are more and more important to long-term outcomes. And yet, at least in the investment world, they're still structurally pretty under-researched. And so the idea is if you put time and attention into understanding them more completely, you can come up with better decision-making, better ultimate results. But to do that, you also have to have individuals and skill sets that are not too siloed. A lot of folks in finance, including myself, trained in very conventional financial tools in a very intense way. But if you want to take this more holistic approach, in addition to, not instead of, those traditional financial tools, you need to be able to understand a fair amount of science, what's happening with planetary science. You need to understand social sciences, how to think about things that might impact societies or health of institutions over time. We need to put all these ingredients together. And so that means a really different kind of team. It really is what led to my own path in leaving investing after almost 20 years of practice to go back and strengthen some of those other capacities. So I earned a philosophy degree at Divinity School, went back and studied biomimicry with an idea of getting closer to the natural systems that we knew were at the heart of this work, and pulling all of that information also into the approach we have now to investing, we think makes it more complete. I sometimes say there's no greater gift than to go back to school mid-career. So, like, don't buy a sports car, don't get a haircut. Like, just go back to school and find something else to study. In my case, I was trying to get to the real roots of some of the key questions on sustainability. And so looking at programs in sustainable business, for example, weren't quite a match for what I was trying to get at. So the idea, for example, of thinking about individual good versus collective good. We've studied this for centuries and centuries and centuries, and yet that ancient debate and the wisdom that goes with it is hardly ever brought into our more applied current decision-making context. We know a lot about structures of power and how they evolve over time. And again, there are modern applications of those ideas that are really important, but sometimes we pretend as if the questions we're asking now have never, ever been asked before in the history of the world. And even though the setting is different, I think the questions actually are pretty perpetual questions where we can learn a lot from understanding that root layer of wisdom. We work with a lot of entrepreneurs, and my number one question, both for them and for our own team, is always whether we're sure we understand the system that whatever it is that's being developed is going to fit within. Some forms of entrepreneurship, especially the last few years, have prided themselves on being disruptive, and working entirely outside of an existing system. And there are situations where that is a match for the need at hand. But pretty often we'll see a fantastic invention in energy supply or material science, for example, and those types of inventions typically need to fit within the existing infrastructure and partners and products and services that already are up and running and working. If you can find an invention that can swap in to that existing system and create a lot of benefit, it's kind of like emergent engineering if you're talking about complexity science. You have something that can be inserted at the root level of a system, and then the system takes over from there. And you don't have to push so hard. You don't have to do all that work yourself. Whereas if you invent a new technology that involves new regulation and new manufacturing and new deployment and entirely new customers and a business case that isn't yet proven, like, whoa, that is a lot of weight on you as an entrepreneur. If you have solved 3 or 4 of those equations already, you're way ahead in the game. And so when I talk about doing systemic analysis and about how helpful it's been to be affiliated with the Santa Fe Institute, it's that broader understanding of complex adaptive systems that really helps inform our thinking about where a given innovation might fit within that broader systemic function. Sometimes I think the work of the last couple centuries was splitting the world into finer and finer specialties so we could really go deep and learn a lot of precise knowledge. And that was hugely important. But I think the work of our time might be knitting it back together again so it doesn't all sit in these discrete silos. And I've kind of lived this myself. Like when I was at Divinity School, it wasn't so clear. Not only were people not checking their stock quotes when we had a break in class, but they weren't so sure about capitalism. And like, wow, what a healthy thing to go from 20 years of investment practice to a community where there was this deeper foundational question that was being kind of re-examined, and to engage in that kind of conversation instead of just presuming, everything was fine at that root layer. Similarly, going back to study biomimicry and really kind of reawakening the wonder of the natural world along with the science just gives you a whole different way to think about things like regenerative systems. It's not a figment. You can see them all around us in a really tangible way. So the idea that we can learn directly from nature, not in a metaphorical, poetic sense, but in a really direct scientific sense, whole new library of solutions that we hardly ever look to. So to me, when you get rid of those silos, you not only add perspectives, but you bring in wisdom from all the other silos that is probably going to be really relevant to solving whatever it is that's the problem you have right in front of you. And so that's why I'm so passionate about it. I think investing in some ways, at least the way that we're doing it, it's a big liberal arts endeavor, right? You need to have all the quantitative skills and all the traditional finance. But these other questions are the ones that give you better inputs that ultimately can get you to those better results. You probably heard I really hate pie charts. It's a weird little thing I have, but I passionately, dislike pie charts, and the reason is they almost always are misused. Pretty often, when we have an issue we really care about, the first thing we want is to make it look more tidy, and so we really desperately want it to fit in, like, a 2 by 2 matrix or pie chart form so we can kinda get our arms around it, and some questions really lend themselves to that kinda depiction, but my challenge with the pie chart is that it automatically puts you in a fixed pie mindset, in a zero sum sort of mindset. And for most of the interesting questions we're trying to solve, especially questions within the investment realm, the last thing you want is a zero sum pie. If you're investing in a company where the best that they can do is to take share from their number one competitor over time, it might be a good investment, but it's bounded in a really specific way. Whereas if you find an investment in something that is solving a need that the world vividly, passionately has that has never been solved before. Whoo! It's like open-ended in terms of the value creation. It's a whole different story. So you need that other dimension, that goes beyond just the flatness of a pie chart. It's true for individual investments, and I think it's true when we aggregate them into broader financial practice as well. I'm also a beekeeper, which we haven't touched on, and maybe that's a way to tie it all together. There's one form of beekeeping where you really take charge and you try to manage the bees. It's a very popular form of beekeeping, don't get me wrong. But boy, you're fighting all the time. And I think there are a lot of parallels there to many of our collective works within the sustainability realm. Like you can only fight against something for so long. A lesson I took from Divinity School is that every successful movement over time has shifted at some point from being against, what are you fighting against, to what are you fighting for? And so this question, what are you fighting for? I think carries across all these dimensions. As a beekeeper, the best thing you can do is try to set the conditions for the bees themselves to do the work to thrive and to tend to their own well-being. I think this is true across lots of different systems. So if you put them in a great location where there are tons of native wildflowers and no pesticides and they're appropriately sheltered, like that goes a long way towards them being able to thrive on their own. There are parallels to that, I think, across all sorts of different systems. And yet, what we choose is instead to pick the single worst location, put all the cards against you, and then try to fight them one by one by one by one. So, thinking at that root level, again, about a whole system and this question of what are the ingredients for thriving in this system and how many of those can we put into place so that then everything else can kind of generate itself from that healthy soil, from that healthy root system. It's not very glamorous. It's much more glamorous to say, I invented a thing. Look at the thing. And to kind of productize everything. But I think if we do tend to this root layer with more care, a lot of other things can then spring up from that we don't have to micromanage every step of the way.